we'll now transition into our panel discussion. So thank you all for sitting behind me there. Here we go, the panel. So the topic for the panel, from bleaching to blooming, strategies for coral reef recovery. I'm just gonna change my notes here very quickly. I'm very pleased to be joined by a really excellent panel of speakers with a real diversity of perspectives on the topic. And clearly, coral reefs are something that, the loss of coral reefs is something that are very evocative. People really, resonate. That sort of story resonates, and it's easy to get sort of doom and gloom about it. But I do think there are signs of hope, there are things to be hopeful about, and I do want to start a conversation there. But first, let me introduce our speakers. So, to my right, David Smith, Chief Marine Scientist at Mars. We had your colleague on one of our panels earlier this morning, hearing a lot about the fantastic work that Mars is doing around coral restoration and other areas of ocean conservation. Hussein Al-Safadi, Chief Executive of Aqaba Development Corporation. And I would like to thank Aqaba Development Corporation as the sponsor for this panel. Tali Vardi, Executive Director of the Coral Restoration Consortium. Philippe Cousteau, co-founder of Earth Echo International and founder of Voyacy Ventures. And then last but not least, Professor Carlos Duarte, Distinguished Professor of Marine Science at King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. So, as I said, I think it would be good to start from a position of hope. Right? What's going well in the space? I'm sure there are areas that we want to cover as well where a lot more progress is needed, or maybe you tell me, what your sort of temperature check is around where we're at in terms of coral restoration. David, maybe I'll go with you. What do you find hopeful, but how are you seeing things right now?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the invite. It's great to be part of this distinguished panel. At Mars, we focused on coral reef restoration for a long period of time now, which might surprise many. It surprised me when I first joined a confectionery company, well, I thought it was a confectionery company, but we've been involved in restoration since 2003. And during that time, there's been periods where it's been difficult to see whether or not restoration can play a meaningful impact in the wider conservation tool. But since about 2011, we've engaged with communities around Indonesia, and I suppose what's really driven hope is the passion and enthusiasm of those communities to get involved in the direct restoration and conservation of their own reefs. So one of our, is actually aptly named Hope Reef, one of our big projects out in Indonesia, I think, is room for optimism, ocean optimism. The program itself has elicited quite excitement from the community. And in the location where we're based, we have 100-odd community members involved with the restoration, 40 academics. It's a really good flagship project to get people interested and excited. There's a whole bunch of metrics that we can include looking at the ecological success of the restoration. There we've seen corals go from about 5% cover up to 70% cover in about 3 or 4 years using the technique that we've used. The caveat being this is the coral triangle, where corals grow really, really quickly. But in that particular site, there's nearly 700,000 or 800,000 corals out planted by that team. And it's by the community, for the community. And I think that sort of collaborative feel for the project is one thing I'd like to highlight.
And so from the sort of technological point of view, or the scientific point of view, our ability to have the right technologies to enable that restoration, have we seen some good innovations there? Are we in a good place with that, or there's still lots of unknowns?
Well, I think probably everyone would agree that the speed of technological development has really ramped up recently. There's some fantastic projects around the world, represented here as well, which is driving innovation. And some of the problem with coral reef, the difficulty, the exciting opportunity about coral restoration is that it's locally context, environmentally context. And so there's different approaches, different ways to think about the innovation space. One, yes, there's high levels of technology development that we can lean into. But the second thing is how you translate that innovation into a sort of local community setting where you can scale. Right. And the biggest issue that we're all, I'm sure, will come up with is scale, both in time and space. How can you conserve and restore corals so they'll survive the next big marine heat wave? And how can you get restoration to be 100, 1,000 times bigger? So the innovation is needed there, and we feel getting that technology development into a community setting is one way in which we can deliver that.
Excellent. So Philippe, I'm going to come to you on this question of scale. So we'll bounce around a little bit on the panel here. Where are we at in terms of scale? Are we able to scale? And again, or what also are you hopeful about? What are you seeing that gives you hope in this space?
Well, first, I want to thank The Economist as well. As Tatiana knows, I've told her many times, I'm a huge fan of The Economist. I think truly it's a pillar of the free world, so journalistic pillar. So thank you for having us here. And of course to our partners at ADC. Amazing things happening in Jordan, which we'll talk about in just a second. I want to echo what David said about scale and the opportunity, right? There's only opportunities, we can't focus on the problems. And I do believe that we're at a tipping point here where we're going to see some really extraordinary, including the work that we're doing in Jordan, advancements in thinking about how we bring different breakthrough technologies together to achieve that scale. And it's I think back actually 25 years ago when I first met Dr. David Vaughn at a lab in Florida, and he was growing corals for the aquarium trade, and I said to him, Dave, do you think, I was 19, didn't know not to ask maybe silly questions, but I said, Dave, do you think we could actually aquaculture corals for reef restoration in the wild? He said, I don't know, but we could try. And so we were the first. We launched the Coral Reef Restoration Initiative with funding from Disney 25 years ago, and Dr. Dave has since pioneered all that technology, first at Mode, and then his organization, Planet Million Corals, and he's now our partner in our company, Buoyancy. And so the advancement of those technologies of aquaculture, of growing, actually breeding more climate resilient corals, certainly the interesting work in genetics and places like House are doing, lots of really fun things that are happening, which I'll get into more in a second. But I'm certainly optimistic about the future. Have to be, otherwise, yikes.
Yeah,
It's pretty grim.
yeah. Carlos, I'm going to come to you just as we stay on this point about sort of the science and innovation that we're seeing.
Yeah, so maybe reacting a bit to what has been said already. So in the scientific community, we debate a lot about the semantics of optimism and hope. So optimism is a life attitude that expects that everything will be fine without us doing anything about it. So I'm not optimistic about the future.
Right.
And hope, instead, is another look into the possibility that recognizes the challenges and the difficulties, but still sees that if we try hard and we work hard, we can still have a positive outcome. So I'm hopeful about the future of corals, but not optimistic. And what kind of supports that hope, and I'll share a story that is inspiring, is that during the COVID lockdown in Bali, so Bali was closed down, so we go back to Indonesia, which is a place for hope, both for David and me. Then they were strictly locked down for about 2.5 years, and the entire economy of Bali depends on tourism. So they were actually starving. It's not a metaphor. Families were starving, communities were starving. And then the Indonesian government, inspired by a friend of mine, then decided to release COVID relief funds, not for people to stay at home or give them food packages, but for people to participate in coral restoration. So they engaged 10,000 people in coral restoration. They were paid a salary, which they could then feed themselves, to engage in coral restoration, including 3,000 scuba divers. All of the scuba divers that are in Bali are actually serving the tourism industry. They were not tourists to take scuba diving, and they managed to restore 1 square kilometer, pretty much, of coral reef within five months. And very limited investment. And the investment actually was to support communities. And now the legacy of that is not only a reasonably thriving coral reef, which I actually have seen myself, but also a sense of attachment and gratitude of people to corals. Because when they were in desperate times, corals fed them. We always say that corals feed people through fisheries and so on. It was never more tangible how corals feed people than in that predicament. So that also help us bring the future of corals to the human scale, and I'll go back to that. But on the challenge side, then as you might know, the world reached 1.5 degree of temperature above pre-industrial levels 1.5 years ago. So in 2022, a collective of scientists then alerted the world in an influential paper that we were on track to reach 1.5 degree in a decade. They were wrong. It only took 1 year. So, and the IPCC had predicted, not themselves, but they reviewed literature that predicted that if we reach 1.5 degree of temperature, we will be at risk of losing 70 to 90% of the world's coral reefs. We are now collecting data, but what I'm starting to collect, but there will be a formal report released at the end of the year, is that we probably have lost between 30 to 40% of living coral reefs in the last year and a half. So we don't have much time, and there's a sense of urgency that is actually reflected in this formal document of the conference. So I don't know if you are formal delegates to any of the country delegations, but there was a series of documents released on Sunday and protocolized, handed over to the co-presidents, President Macron and the President of Costa Rica. And one of them is this one, that reads urgent call to action to conserve and restore shallow water coral reefs. So I invite you to look at this. It's just one pager, and it really has 5 actions. One is enhance the ambition to mitigate climate change, remove local pressures, which are actually responsible for about half of the loss. So even though we emphasize climate change, still much of the loss is due to issues with water quality and other pressures that can be relatively easily removed. Support collaborative efforts to develop cost-effective, scalable and climate-proven technologies to restore and conserve coral reefs, which have been discussed by David and also Philippe. Strengthen and support global coral initiatives that try to scale these efforts globally and deploy sufficient financial resources to conserve and restore coral reefs. So I lead the CORDA, which is the Global Coral R&D Accelerator Platform. It's a G20 instrument, but we fund collaborative research globally to advance the technology to be able to do that, to secure a future for coral reefs. We're funding, and in fact, Dr. Tali Vardi is one of the members of our scientific and advisory committee. So we are now currently funding about 350 research institutions across 66 nations, but we need more and we need to do it faster. So really the thought that I would like to share with you is that I have a grandson called Oliver, and I work with him on whenever I have a chance to put him on my lap, and we go through coloring books. He loves dinosaurs, right? So he has coloring books where he goes and draws dinosaurs, and he perfectly knows that the dinosaurs disappeared because there was a meteorite that hit us. So the thing that is in my mind that I want to avoid in any possible way is that when you have your grandchildren on your lap and they're reading on your coloring books, the next page is not about dinosaurs, but it's about coral reefs. And that they will learn about coral reefs in the next page to dinosaurs because they're no longer with us. And there's no meteorite for coral reefs. The meteorite is us, every one of us in this room, including myself. So no one is able to speak about the unborn. No one is able to speak about the grandchildren of Oliver. But really what is at stake is not the livelihoods of fishermen in Indonesia or tourism developers. So what is at scale is our responsibility toward the unborn. So who can speak on behalf of the unborn? Only families can. Only families care about continuity. The people that are discussing the blue zone are discussing things that have a much shorter timeline. But I end by quoting Martin Luther King, who in a very different context, he said that we need to come to accept that tomorrow is today and confront the fierce urgency of the now and dedicate ourselves to the bitter and hard struggle for a better world. So that the hope is going to come from us waking up, stop sleepwalking towards that future of the coral book, having coral reefs there, and then do something about it. And we know what we need to do. It's just these 5 things. And we need everybody to take collective action because we only have 5 years.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Carlos. I was intrigued that you mentioned sort of local pressures as being a cause. So I want to dig into that, but I also want to bring in our other 2 panelists to hear their voice on this, set the scene. Hussein, I want to come to you. I know Jordan well, actually, but I didn't realize that there were coral reef in Aqaba. You want to tell us a little bit about the situation in Aqaba? And I know that in some ways the reef there, because of the thermal heat, the is sort of thermally resilient, so it offers potentially, correct me if I'm wrong, some examples or possible lessons for how you protect coral reef when waters are heated up. But you want to tell us a little bit about your perspective?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's glad and great pleasure to be here and sponsoring this interesting panel. Just to highlight about Aqaba. Aqaba is the coast of 27 kilometers length of coast. The east coast is Asia and the west coast is Africa. Aqaba is between Asia and Africa, connecting 3 countries, just to highlight, and it's part of the Golden Triangle, Petra, Wadi Rum, and Africa. It's a very unique location. As you mentioned, Jonathan, yes, the coral reefs, Aqaba known as the home for the corals, for the temperature, and it's unique, and that location and that temperature allow Aqaba to play a major role to protect the marine life and to do the balance in the marine life world. This is very important. Therefore, as Aqaba Development Corporation, just to give an idea, we are the investment arm of the government in the territory of Aqaba. We are responsible to develop the infrastructure, part of that to protect the coast and to enabling with the private sector the initiatives. And recently we are really honored to announce His Majesty King Abdullah II yesterday at the conference announced the initiative of Aqaba Blue Venture with our champion, Mr. Philip Costeau and Boise from their worldwide experience, and we started to establish the first pilot project in Aqaba for the coral restoration and regeneration, to protect that and to Aqaba to play a role as pioneer in that sector and that topic, and to export that industry. And as Mr. David mentioned previously about the scaling, and we are focusing to develop the young generation within our local community, to develop their skills and to integrate with Boise, to integrate with the expert that they visited us and established that pilot project. And we are really glad, and all of you you are invited to visit this pilot project, and this is going to be phase 1. There will be another phases that will be linked and engaged between the tourism side and the industrial side. I will not talk a lot about the technical side. Definitely Mr. Philip is the expert. I look as a government sector, by the way, with this suit, as a comparison with our friends. Therefore, he will cover the technical side.
Thank you, saying. So we'll dive into some of those topics, but Talia, I want to bring you in. So the Coral Restoration Consortium, what is it? Who's in the consortium? Are you hopeful?
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. The Coral Restoration Consortium started in 2017 as a way of bringing scientists and practitioners who are just trying to save their reefs in their backyards throughout the world together so that we could translate science faster and get restoration going more efficiently everywhere. So it's a way of scaling up by building community. And the urgency for doing restoration throughout the world has only grown in the 8 years that we've been around. So we started during the 3rd global mass bleaching event because in the Caribbean and Florida, people had been doing restoration already for a while because the conditions in the Caribbean are quite bad. However, during that 3rd global mass bleaching event, we saw reefs being killed off by bleaching that were pristine beforehand. In the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you would see bleached reefs, and people they wanted to save their reefs, the reefs that support these communities, that have built cultures over millennia. And so there are people right now all over the world. There are 300 different coral restoration organizations, and most of them are doing very rudimentary coral restoration, fragmentation, gardening, and they need a lot of support, right? So that's really where we're at. That's really our role, is to make those people feel hopeful, supported, and get them to be doing restoration as best as they can. And really, it should be some of them up here on the stage rather than us telling them how dire this need is, because these are people that are being actually displaced from their homes because of sea level rise and reef destruction at the same time.
What do they need?
Most of all,
Money.
funding.
Yeah.
But also a lot of support. So we have a conference every 2 years called Reef Futures, and we just had it in December. And you would think, oh my God, a bunch of coral scientists and practitioners, like how they must be like all crying into their sleeves. But it is an incredible conference because people are really hopeful and they're doing something for their reefs. And I'm a scientist. As much as I understand that global warming is bearing down on us and the 1.5 we have already passed and the future looks extremely grim, there's also so much genetic diversity left in corals. They are crazy, weird, complicated creatures that are rocks and animals and plants really all in one. They were the first animal really to evolve. And there's so much capability still, and if there are, what we're doing now is really keeping pockets of genetic material throughout the world where reefs currently exist and where there are these partners who are dedicated to restoring them, so that in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, with technology, with cryopreservation, with innovation, there is something to build back from. That's where we are.
Philip, maybe I'll come to you just on the financing, right? Is that, where is most financing for coral reef restoration? Do we have a sense of where it's coming from, sort of breakdown of it, and how do we make it more, how do we unlock the finance? What are some of the barriers?
John, that's a great question. I think that there's certainly not enough finance that exists, which is why, just yesterday, as Suzanne mentioned, His Majesty, who I've had the honor to be able to work with and know for several years now, who is an extraordinary ocean lover and champion, by the way. He's so passionate about the ocean, and so we've had the opportunity now, we're collaborating with the country of Jordan, with our company Boise Regen, and with a partnership with ABC to launch an innovation hub in Aqaba. We have thousands more to go, and we need to move quickly. And so the question then is, how do we do that? And bringing through multiple different breakthrough technologies in order to recognize that coral reef restoration is important, but only one piece of the puzzle of what coral reefs can do for their own sake. So how do we start thinking about unlocking financing? Coral reefs are extraordinary barriers against storm surge, amazing for coastal resilience. And that's an issue that needs to be built and increased around the world. Coastal resilience is a threat to communities and neighborhoods and people all over the world as coral reefs decline and these communities suffer. And so by bringing together technologies with our partner Spera, who is leading a marine infrastructure company, companies like Conservation Labs and AI, we're bringing all of them together in coral farms to build a cutting-edge facility in Aqaba. Jordan is the custodian of some of the last healthy reefs on the earth. Combine that, because of their heat tolerance, combine that with Aqaba and the will and the ability for them to move quickly. They have done more in 4 months of building out this campus than we could do in other countries in years. It's extraordinary how quickly they move and how dedicated they are. And so this innovation hub is essentially a demonstration, as His Majesty spoke about it yesterday, for the world to show how we bring these breakthrough technologies together, not only to restore reefs, but to unlock the financing to build coastal resilience. That's where we believe the money is. Right? If you can say, I can rebuild a 10-kilometer coral reef for $100 million and protect $10 billion worth of infrastructure, millions of lives and communities, and by the way, also provide jobs and opportunity to those local communities by training them how to grow the coral, how to run the farms, how to outplant those corals, exactly what Tali was talking about. It's a win-win. And we're building biodiversity, and we're building biomass, and we're building the blue economy. There's multiple levels of benefit there. So in order for us to be able to build at scale, we need to unlock the financing that is really tied into, we believe, things like coastal resilience, insurance, parametric insurance, bonds, and simply infrastructure funds. This should be as simple as a country saying, we build roads, we build dams, we build that kind of infrastructure. They should also be building coral reefs to protect, and that will unlock the billions required in order to reach the scale that we need in order to ensure that coral reefs don't disappear.
Ellie.
Yeah, that I don't disagree with those points, and the in fact, when I first saw Mike Beck's report on the coastal resilience work in 2016, I said to him, that is the silver bullet. However, in the places that reefs are, there is not billions of dollars of buildings and coastal infrastructure. So the value isn't there. So in the places where reefs mostly are, you actually, they don't have roads. They don't have that infrastructure.
So you need to make a different argument, right?
Yes, and one thing I learned at the BEF on Saturday is that, even according to funders themselves, that the funding for coral reefs is really strangely kind of falls through the cracks. There's money for oceans, there's money for for biodiversity, that's mostly terrestrial. The money for oceans mostly goes to big ocean, like deep sea ocean, that kind of stuff. And coral reefs are kind of coastal, kind of ocean, kind of biodiversity. They're many things, and there's really not dedicated funding. And in fact, I had a very positive conversation yesterday about having a funders meeting to actually unlock map this out so it can be very clear. But I think we also have a lot of work to do in the coral community ourselves in really laying out what's needed and really kind of setting the bar where it needs to be.
Carl, I was going to come to you just on that point about how do you make the same almost economic argument that you do with coastal resilience for reefs that don't have better, not necessarily as close to those.
So I'm going to walk you through the global calculations that may make the problem unsolvable and almost impossible. And then I'm going to unpack those global calculations and bring them down to the human scale, and you will see that this is doable. So, in fact, one of the mysteries of the poor investment in corals is that we did not have an estimate of the global extent of corals until just last year. Wow. So there's been an estimate that carries on the literature of about 300,000 square kilometers of reefs. No one has checked that. If you see what the statement comes from, it's a guesswork in 1970s.
Right.
Right? 50 years of work depending on that guess, right?
Wow.
So finally, the Allen Coral Atlas, that was a project funded by the Paul Allen Foundation with Planet and many others, then released in 2019 global imagery of corals. So, but they did not really extract the data from there. So last year we published the first estimate of the global area covered by corals, but reefs that contain living corals, because most of the reef is actually a Scandinavian word that means a shallow hard bottom structure, right? Most of the reefs are not coral reefs, they're reefs that are rocky outcrops and so forth. So when you really look at how many of those reefs support living corals, the area is about 53,000 square kilometers, right? And then we also calculated and we produced a data set with the size, shape, and location of every one of the reefs. There are 1.5 million coral reefs when you extract them from those images, and the median size is 0.3 hectares. That's about 3,000 square meters. So now, when you read any paper on coral reefs, we start by saying that coral reefs are really very important because they support, and depending on who comes with, might say 1 million livelihoods, billion livelihoods. So now let's do some simple math, which is wrong, but it's simplified.
Yeah.
So now we have, with the 53,000 square kilometers, we need to conserve them all. So all of them need to be in area-based management, but we probably need to restore about 7,000 square kilometers. And if we look how much we have restored in total, since we started doing that work, we have not restored more than possibly 2 square kilometers. So what we need to do in 5 years is 4,000 times the job that we've done in the last 50. So it seems impossible, but let's now unpack that into the human scale. So if there are 1.5 million coral reefs, and we take one characteristic coral reef as 3,000 square meters, the area to be restored in that coral reef is about 600 square meters, which is 2 tennis courts, right? So if Philippe and I are fishermen in a particular community with no infrastructure, but him and I, and our ancestors and our father and grandparents have been fishing that reef for generations, we really care about that reef. We don't care about the 5,000. We cannot really think about the global extent of coral reefs, but we care about that reef. So Philippe and I will get out every weekend, take one day off in the weekend, and we'll just go and get the job done in 1 year. Him and I can do it. We probably need a couple $1,000, and we will need how to do it, to know how to do it in ways that are better than the ways that we were doing it before. But let's park that for a second. So Philippe and I, Philippe is called now Xin Han, and I'm called Xu Yi. So Xin Han and Xu Yi, every Saturday we take 5 hours and go and restore the reefs. In 1 year we've done the 600 square meters for our reef, the one we care. So if there are 1 billion people whose livelihoods depends on coral reefs, it will just take 0.5 of them, of those people, to care enough about the coral reef to be Xinjiang and me and go and do it. So we really have the scale of people to be able to do the job. And they need $2,000 each, but when you multiply $2,000 by 1.5 billion reefs, that's $3 billion. But for a reef, it's $2,000. And you can actually sponsor saving a reef for a couple $1,000, right? So it is not hard, we can do it. The people have the need to and the motivation to do it. We just need to give them the tools, and that's what the Coral Restoration Consortium is doing. In fact, we are partnering with them to create a global coral restoration solution hub. And there might be multiple, in some areas, like protecting the shoreline and the infrastructure is going to be terribly important. In areas where there are no roads, I visited a place called Tokelau Reef. I went around the world with an expedition that I led in 2010. And there was one day where we crossed the daytime divide, and that's the only day in 9 months that we did work. So we were by a reef called Tokelau that belongs to Kiribati. That reef has about 200 people living there. It was already damaged. You could see that the lagoon was broken, and I think probably in 10 years that will be gone, right? So there's no infrastructure, but the whole existence of that reef and that community depends on defending the reef. So they need to deploy hybrid infrastructure, not to defend roads and buildings, but to defend their land. Right? So I think we can get it done, and we need the tools. We need the tools, and we need a way to communicate the tools and empower those people who have the willingness, because they care about that reef, to get the job done. But when you boil it to the human scale, it just takes 2 people from the community that care enough about the reef to dedicate half a day every weekend with a little bit of support to get the job done.
What are those tools?
The tools
they need.
Yeah. So there is no silver bullet to restore coral reefs. There's not one solution. And in fact, we're working at Corda. We're finding 5 streams of solutions. And each of them is going to have a contribution, but we need to assemble them all and design them as a global solution. So that design needs to be done, and that's what Buoyancy Region is doing. Buoyancy Region is not working on a particular solution. They are actually working 360 from the finances to the framework of the reef, to the technologies to fragment the reef, to make them climate resilient, to incorporate all of the solutions. So we need a design of solutions, and they come in about 5 kind of pillars of solutions. We just need to train people how to use those 5 solutions. It's not going to be about robots eventually, because robots don't pay taxes and then don't feed people. So in some context, it's actually better to have people involved than to have robots. But it's going to be about designing how those solutions come together, and then through a Coral Restoration Consortium, then share that capacity. And also we're developing a global academy for coral reef practitioners. I think we can get the job done. It's obviously hard, but it's hopeful.
Yeah. So tell me, I know you want to come in, and then I'll bring you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about financing, which was a question to Philippe. So the thing that I heard the most at the Beth was about, from the bankers and from the insurance folks, is, you know, these double bottom lines that are needed for this impact investment in the ocean economy and finance. They were like, you scientists, you need to give us the metrics. You need to tell us what is a successful restoration. How do you measure it? We need some simple metrics, and you need to agree on them, and you need to tell us what they are. And $2,000 would probably get a restoration started, But what it would not do is actually help measure those metrics. And it's, in some cases, it's more expensive to measure the reef and report out on that. I mean, there are cheaper ways of doing it, but it's just a cost that just, that funding just doesn't exist anywhere,
Right.
and yet it is what, apparently, it will unlock that big financing.
Interesting point. So, David, and actually our next panel is on technology and actually around sensors and things that there's costs are going down. That's becoming more accessible. But David, I want to bring you in. Obviously, corporates aren't necessarily going to come in with the sort of levels of financing that we've been hearing about. But I understand Mars thinks about its role in coral reef restoration as part of its sort of long-term business resiliency. And obviously, Mars is making this an investment. But maybe could you talk a little bit about what you're investing, what is Mars investing, how do you view that investment, how can you unlock more industry players in investing?
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually a marine biologist that sits in a corporate.
Yeah.
So I don't have the suit. I'm going to grow into that suit in a while. So I'm talking from a marine biologist point of view here. It's quite enlightening that corporate is willing on their P&L, on their actual business, to actually invest in coral restoration because they understand that the future of that business, looking across multiple generations, depends on a vibrant, flourishing planet. And coral reefs are really, at the time, and still now actually, as we've been speaking about, and traditionally have been underfunded, and there's not enough solutions being put out there to make a difference. So it's a core business funded model. There are other different ways in which the business looked over the years. We have a lot of contractors in different parts of the world where coral reefs are. Their very livelihoods depends on the protein that comes from their reefs, and even if they're working on a farm, it's an interconnected ecosystem. So it's really important that for the future of the business that we develop those opportunities. And then there's purpose-led brands, trying to get a brand excited about making a difference in the world. The Sheep Hope Rose project is exactly that. How can they put their money behind a program that's going to make a measurable difference? So it's about generating that excitement and telling the story in the right way to try and get further investment. And obviously, mine and my team's role to show what can be done and to drive that excitement. And yes, not optimism, hope. But let me come back to another point, and because what's really nice sometimes when you set up here, we know each other obviously, but some of the stories that are being told in your analysis, and also some of the problems that Tally was mentioning, we're also looking at the problem in that sense, and the way we positioned it was, and I think it comes back to the human angle, it's really important that we don't just get too dizzy about the big global targets, which are insurmountable. They're terrifying and will stop you getting up in the morning and going to work, really. We need to be able to restore reefs at a scale that's relevant to the communities within which we work. That's the key business, and consequently, if we can empower communities and facilitate those communities to have the techniques and the technology to develop that restoration, we just need more communities to do so. And that's where we get to a point, we call it our Hope Rose program, to get as much capacity out there as we can, and then coordinate it in some way, which is going to be the challenge. But we think that's probably the way in which we need to go. The second piece I'd say about the economy, and something that's been mentioned in other panels and will be mentioned in the panel tomorrow, is there's a lot of critical industries that depend on the beauty, the biodiversity, and the quality of reef for their fundamental business. The tourism industry. Surely we can tap into the tourism industry and say, look, if you rebuild and restore your reefs, you're going to get a profitable gain from that. That's really important. But there's no point our organisation going to an organisation in a 5-star luxury resort, which we do, but to rebuild their reefs, unless there's positive benefit for the communities in which they represent, in a sense. So you're trying to, like a twinning project. If we provide the training and the capacity for one resort, who are they twinned with? What community project can they actually champion? And start to spread the love, really, in that sense.
Excellent. And I want to say, I'm conscious that we have a lot of expertise and insight in the audience as well. So I do want to come to you early, actually. So do get your questions ready. But Hussein, I just want to hear a little bit in terms of how do you think about in Aqaba, how do you, your tourism strategy, your coastal development strategy, how do those align with your coral restoration strategy, right? How do you ensure that your development doesn't end up undermining corals?
Very much, Jonathan. Actually, about the funds, don't worry. If this profile, I will obtain funds. Don't worry about our approach investors and secure some. Actually, in Aqaba now, we are we're thinking just considering to initiate many programs in terms of green and blue economy as well. We started with the green hydrogen. We approached international companies, around 12 companies now, to establish their factories and they've started already their studies, because we do believe that this will be in the near future one of the power resource. In addition to that, ADC as a company, we own the ports. And this is very important just to about the decarbonization of the ports. And we've signed an agreement with an international AP Muller to decarb the ports and to reach 70% zero carbon in 2030 and to 100% zero by 2040. This is very important, in addition to the agri-food organic corridor that we are developing now in Aqaba. But this is a chain, not only the ocean that we are responsible and the coral restoration. It is the overall green and the blue ecosystem and ecotourism as well. As I mentioned, the pilot project now that we are doing with our partners, YC, the science park, that the regeneration and restoration of the corals, that will be as a pilot to generate and build that positive momentum to upscale the young generation to be integrated in that. And phase 2 with YC as well, we are designing now a mega project, the Aqaba Marine Park, that will contain R&D, the research, aquarium, entertainment, and that will be as well combining with tourism and science as well. And will be reflecting on the overall tourism and ecotourism sector in Africa. In this occasion, just if you allow me, Jonathan, just to thank His Excellency Mr. Shadi Majali, he's the Chief Commissioner, and Dr. Tariq Al-Ghazali from the Royal Court. They were behind us that we reached this point with His Majesty's announcement yesterday. They supported us from day one, Hussein and Philippe and Boyce team, to reach this significant point. Thank you very much.
So I want to come to you, the audience. Who has some questions or comments? I see a hand up front here.
My voice? No? Okay. Hi, I'm Sarah. I spent about 25 years but I recently had a personal experience and just scratched my head a little bit when it comes to the I didn't have children and I can't life it's incredible as you would expect, but then a dear friend of mine who lives there and the area was so thriving and amazing was about 9% less than a year. And so my question to you is, the water temperature was measured as 31 degrees there for us, it's like 28 degrees when we were there. So when you talk about this sort of artisanal or local, when you talk about this sort of artisanal or local coral reef restoration efforts that I think are very important, how do you deal with it when it comes to these types of water temperatures? Because the local populations wouldn't have access to those heat-tolerant corals. So what do we do there when the temperatures, it might go down and they can restore, but then they go back up and they bleach. So what are your recommendations or thoughts around sort of thinking into the future for that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and kind of the most obvious one, and it's amazing that you took your kids to learn how to scuba dive, because that is critical, because they're not quite that age yet, but we need to do that. It's very depressing, right?
We have hope.
But we have hope, but just to answer your question, I think it's really important. So places like that, and Raja Ampat is a place with a lot of tourism and a lot of infrastructure. Let's say they rebuilt that reef with restoration, like Carlos's example, where they, got, was it 10,000 people, employed. And in Indonesia, there's still so much There are larvae out there. You can see reefs regrowing. Just if someone puts down a mesh wire on rubble, you can see a reef regrowing. And so what we're doing right now as a human community is a natural experiment. And there are corals that will survive bleaching events, and a new reef will regrow. And will it look the same? No. We are doing massive species composition difference. So all those acroporids might be gone in the reefs in 30 years, and you'll have more massive corals. That's just a reality. That's a very likely reality. And so that's actually why a lot of restoration practitioners are actually using more massive corals, and not just the branching corals that grow quickly, because they also bleach quickly. So the reefs of the future will undoubtedly look different, and the smart restoration practitioners, of which there are many, because they know their reefs way better than anyone else, they take the corals that bleach, they bring them into a nursery, they move them to cooler waters. This is a kind of technology that Austin Bowden Kirby in Fiji has really been promoting a lot, and restore reefs in cooler waters, again, so that there's something to build back from in the coming decades.
I'll maybe add a bit more nuance to that. First of all, I sympathize with that experience, because I've also witnessed corals that were thriving and beautiful go not just bleached dead. And there's a sense of grief when you see it, but then that actually encouraged me to try harder. It doesn't make me give up. So I just need to try harder. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's not about one solution, it's about assembling solutions. And then we are working on Horda, we're working on 5 streams of solutions. So obviously one of them is natural selection, but we don't want to go that road, because obviously by now, so when I mentioned that the atmosphere has exceeded 1.5 degree of warming, that actually translates, that's the atmosphere. It translates to 1 degree of warming in the ocean at equilibrium. It's already 1 degree warmer. The corollary there is, on average, the corals that are still living in the ocean are already able to resist more than 1 degree of warming, right? Because otherwise they're gone. But we don't want to go that route, because that would come with devastating loss. But there's already, the corals that are there are already 1 degree more resistant than the ones that were there before we started to warm the planet. Now the second, so this is what is happening without any intervention. But when we intervene, there are different ways to add climate resistance to corals. One of them is to rather naively go and fragment any coral and put them back. Then we can select corals within a particular environment. We don't need to move them and relocate them from distant other nations, other oceans, but oftentimes within a particular location there will be marginal habitats, typically around a mangrove. And so when the water is stagnant, it warms more than the water out in the reef, oftentimes 3 to 4 degrees more. And if you search, often you can find, not every species, but you can find some species of corals that are barely making it there. But those species that don't look that much, small coral colonies, they are actually far more resistant than the conspecifics in the reef. And then you cross them, they are only a few hundred meters away, you cross them and you test them, those crossings, to see which parents give higher thermal resistance. With that, you can get to about 1 degree of intergenerational resistance. So you can bring them to 1 degree more. They already have 1 degree more, so you have now 1 degree. And then also, if you remove local pressures, you're actually removing additional stress, of helping them be more resistant to higher temperatures. Surprisingly, we don't have an estimate of how much climate resistance we can add by removing local pressures, but let's say maybe half a degree more. So 1 degree that has already happened, 1 degree that we can get by selection and selective breeding, and half a degree by cleaning up all of the other stresses that the corals need to cope with. And then there's 2 more strategies. One of them is called coral hardening, which is the Spartan approach to growing coral. So if you remember, the Spartans used to, when a new baby was born, they would put them in the river, in the cold water in the river. If they survive, they're worth nurturing. So the corals, when we grow them, we fragment them into tiny little corals, but we haven't invested yet much on those little tiny fragments. So there's quite good experimental evidence that if we subject them to a shock therapy, and that's the shock therapy that seems to be more consistently effective, is a high salinity shock. Because the waters in the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf are actually high salinity, and that has something to do with the resistance to high temperature. So if you give them a shock therapy, they actually become harder and more withstanding to temperature and other stresses. So that is about half a degree more. And the last family of solutions is about when you're growing the corals to use probiotics, nutraceuticals to make them stronger but making them healthier. So when you assemble all five, and there are many assumptions embedded. One of them is that these are accumulative. They might not be. But I think we can get to 2.5 degree of resistance, but then those are the type of tools and approaches that need to be assembled and designed. So when the people in that reef that you visited are going to try to restore the reef, they just don't put back there when it's going to be wasted again. So, but we can probably achieve 2.5 degree of climate resistance by assembling solutions, but we need to design them, and we need to make them accessible, not to very sophisticated labs, but we need to make them accessible to settings where people don't have access to advanced technology.
Here, and then hand in the back as well, and then I see you as well. Maybe we'll take 3 comments and then come back to the panel for final.
Sure. Thank you so much for the presentations. They were really engaging and interesting. My name is Chloe Dubois. I'm with the Ocean Legacy Foundation, and we've talked a lot about bleaching and warming waters. And I'm just wondering, in addition to that, how are you, or what initiatives are you taking to stop the stony coral tissue loss disease? I was in the Turks and Caicos earlier in the year, and I was shockingly surprised at just how fast the corals are dying off from this disease, and not a lot is known about it, and I'm just wondering if that's incorporated into some sort of larger restoration strategy.
Great, thank you. Just on that, and we'll take comments in the back. If you can, please be brief, because we are running short.
I wanted to ask, Carlos, you said about this 7,000 square kilometers that we need to restore of coral. And then you were just talking then about how we need to incorporate these tools of resilience into restoration rather than everyone just picking up random corals and putting them back on the reef. So how in practice does everyone get involved in a solution when not every reef might be climate resilient and not everyone has access to these tools? Do you think that those 7,000 square kilometers are going to have to be limited to climate resilient locations and to the people who have access to these tools?
Thank you. And if we can, very quickly come back. I'm sorry, the lady here, I did see her just right here. Very brief, and then just a final word, and then we have an announcement from Dr.
Thank you very much. I work in Tanzania with community co-management. And I really love Carlos' enthusiasm, and I wish it was that easy. I think reef restoration is very context specific, and when you're working with communities who depend on fishing for their livelihoods, I think the success of all these initiatives, which actually cost a lot of money and take a lot of time, have best chance of success when they're part of an integrated management solution. When you're working with communities, your management planning, you're looking at existing coral reefs, you're looking at conservation of those, you're looking at other alternative incomes for people who are depending on fisheries. So it's not such a simple solution.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make that comment.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so Director, I don't know if you want to respond, and if anyone else, but then we do have another.
Yes. So in fact, the narrative that I gave about the technical solution, of course, there are many elements to be done in the social context, of course, but I was just responding to the technical solutions are part of a paper that we were commissioned by the journal Nature on facing the coral crisis. So we reflected on that. But having those technical solutions that we're starting to see, what we can do to achieve that thermal climate proofing corals, and many things need to be done. In my opinion, is just a start, right? So the science and technology is a necessary element of the solution, but it's just a start. We need logistics. We need to deploy this at the scale everywhere in everywhere where those 7,000 square kilometers are, sometimes in very distant locations. And we scientists don't know about logistics. So we need people that bring other skill sets. That may be global companies that have distributions in the military, have significant logistic skills. So we need to involve other people that take care of the logistics. We also need, obviously, finances that we discuss. And then we also need to mobilize people. We need capacity building and we need to mobilize society. So I've been reading a lot about that part of mobilizing society, because we can have the tools ready and they might just not be deployed or be deployed just on a demonstration basis. So I've been reading a lot about social tipping points. When we talk about tipping points, in science is often very negative towards something that goes wrong, but you can actually mobilize society and tip society to act quickly if they're inspired. So social tipping points are really about positive narratives of possible hopeful futures, not optimistic futures. And what we need to do, so that there's actually a formal technique called nowcasting, that you imagine a possible future and then you bring back to today what you need to do today to get there. So we need storytelling to mobilize society towards those positive narratives, because frightening people, hammering down with very negative headlines and the very wrong things and bad things that are going to happen just paralyzes people and make them disengage. So mobilizing society, not only the people that are sitting on those reefs, but everyone in those rooms, everyone that is not part of this conference is key. And I don't have the skills to do that. We need the storytellers. We need people that have a voice that can reach society in a context where we have difficulties working together because the world is fragmented. And for instance, I'm working very closely with the sports, because particularly football, soccer, mobilizes 5 billion people when there's a FIFA. And then when your team wins, you don't care who you vote to. You actually hug and celebrate. So sports is a big mobilizer platform. We need to find those voices. And we probably need, I quoted Martin Luther King, but in this terms of predicament, not for colors, but for the whole of humanity, I'm lacking that ethical reference, that voice that can mobilize society to reflect not only on children and colors, but on basic humanistic principles. And then on the disease part, the proliferation of disease in the ocean is not just for colors. We see disease starting to rise across many components of ocean. Some of this is actually a symptom of weakness. So marine life is becoming weaker, not just by climate change, but also pollutants. We are becoming weaker because of pollutants and climate change. So I think when we mitigate those, we can really also address some of the emerging diseases.
Thank you very much. Sorry to hurry up, but we are out of time, and I think that around sort of storytelling and reaching everyone can play a role is one thing that I would take away from this. You tend to think about coral reef restoration as very technical, and obviously there's a technical scientific element to it, but the fact that so many communities and others can get involved, I think is a point of hope. But I'm gonna thank our speakers, but ask them to stay put.